Imagine the Atlantic dark and endless, an ocean that swallowed men and dreams alike. It's the early 1600s. Wooden ships creak against the waves, their sails swollen with both wind and ambition. Aboard them are not conquerors of empires, but wanderers chasing rumors of a new world, a land that might finally break the chokehold of the old. Those first settlers who stepped onto the rough shores of North America weren't thinking of America. They were thinking of survival, of soil that might grow food, of timber to build shelter, of a place where their children might not starve. Yet, even in those moments of desperation, something larger was germinating. The colonies began as fragments: English, Dutch, Spanish, French, different flags, different faiths, but all drawn by one gravitational force, the hope of starting again. And that's where America's true beginning lies, not in conquest, not in royal decree, but in the audacity of ordinary people who believed that tomorrow could be better than today. But hope, as history always reminds us, has a shadow. As ships brought settlers westward, others sailed eastward with human cargo. Africans chained beneath decks, ripped from their homelands, their names erased. The same soil that nurtured freedom was fertilized with injustice. The contradiction was there from the start: liberty for some, bondage for others. Still, out of this chaos, something extraordinary took root. A collective idea that maybe, just maybe, human beings could govern themselves. Across towns and taverns, in whispers and pamphlets, a radical thought began to circulate that kings were not divine, that power could rise from the people, that laws could serve citizens rather than masters. The land itself became a teacher. Its vastness whispered possibility. Its wilderness demanded self-reliance. And over generations, those lessons hardened into culture, a culture restless, inventive, and suspicious of authority. By the mid-1700s, 13 colonies had grown into 13 ambitions. The settlers no longer thought of themselves as outposts of Europe, but as something new, something the old world couldn't quite define. And beneath it all, that invisible current, the American idea, gathered strength. Not a flag yet, not a nation yet, but an experiment waiting to ignite. Some music builds, fading into a low drum beat die. Every civilization begins with a story, and America's first story was the promise of possibility. By this, those 13 colonies were no longer children of empire. They were restless adolescents, testing the limits of authority. What began as frustration over taxes and laws soon evolved into something far deeper, a philosophical rebellion. Because when an idea matures inside a people, you can't chain it to a throne. The American Revolution wasn't just a clash of muskets and declarations. It was a collision between two worldviews. On one side, an empire built on tradition and hierarchy. On the other, farmers, blacksmiths, philosophers, and dreamers who dared to imagine a different future. The revolutionaries didn't fight for wealth or land alone. They fought for agency, the right to define their own destiny. That was a radical thought in a world ruled by monarchs. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he wasn't describing the world as it was. He was describing the world as it ought to be. But revolutions are never pure. Those same words, so bright, so sacred, were written by men who owned slaves. The new nation was born with a contradiction in its bloodstream. The founding fathers built a republic on liberty while denying it to millions. Yet, even in hypocrisy, there was potential, because ideas, once released, cannot be contained. Across the Atlantic, kings trembled. Across the colonies, ordinary people dared to believe they mattered. The war that followed was brutal, chaotic, and uncertain. The British Army was the most powerful in the world, but it was fighting a force it couldn't measure, a people fighting for belief, not empire. The American victory didn't just birth a country. It birthed a new kind of story, one where legitimacy came not from divine right, but from the consent of the governed. It was the first real test of Enlightenment ideals in human history. Could reason replace royalty? Could citizens replace subjects? And when the smoke cleared in 1783, the answer seemed to be yes, but only barely. The newborn republic was fragile, held together by idealism and ink. The Constitution, ratified a few years later, became the blueprint of a great experiment to govern by compromise, to balance freedom with order, to protect the individual while uniting the many. It was imperfect, written by men limited by their time, but it was alive. And that mattered more than perfection. The revolution's energy didn't fade with victory, it morphed. The 1800s would see the republic expand, test its limits, and confront the price of its ideals. For now, though, the world looked to this small cluster of former colonies and saw something extraordinary, a civilization daring to write its own rules. The sound of a pen scratching across parchment fades into the crackle of a fire. They didn't just win independence. They invented the modern idea of freedom and left the rest of the world to catch up. The revolution gave America its birth certificate, but the 1800s gave it its body. What had started as a fragile union along the Atlantic coast now turned its gaze westward, toward the horizon that never seemed to end. Expansion became obsession. Destiny became doctrine. Manifest destiny, they called it. A belief that God Himself had ordained the nation to stretch from ocean to ocean. It was an idea that mixed faith with ambition, poetry with conquest, and like all powerful myths, it justified both greatness and cruelty. The land between the oceans was vast, wild, and ancient, already home to millions of indigenous people whose civilizations had thrived for centuries. But the settlers who moved west saw it as empty. In their eyes, wilderness was not a place to respect. It was a problem to be solved. The Trail of Tears, broken treaties, entire cultures erased under the wheels of progress. The price of expansion was measured in human loss, but the march didn't stop. Each railroad spike, each town built on the frontier was another heartbeat in the growing body of a nation that refused to rest. And yet, in the midst of all this conquest, something extraordinary was also happening. The American spirit of invention began to roar. Steam engines cut through mountains, the telegraph made distance irrelevant, and the cotton gin transformed agriculture, and with it, the nation's moral fault line. Because slavery, that ancient institution, had not vanished with independence. It had adapted. The cotton fields of the South became gold mines of human suffering, their profits fueling the nation's rise while deepening its divisions. Every bale of cotton carried a contradiction. Liberty proclaimed, bondage maintained. The North, industrial and booming, built factories and railways. The South, agrarian and proud, clung to its plantations and its way of life. The collision course was set. But amid these contradictions, the nation was learning what it meant to be American. Immigrants poured in from Ireland, Germany, and beyond, bringing dreams, skills, and hunger. The city swelled. The young republic became a mosaic of languages and ambitions. It was messy, noisy, and full of friction. But that friction created energy, the kind of energy that forges nations. And through it all, a question lingered, a question the founding fathers had left unresolved. Could a country built on freedom survive half slave and half free? By the mid-19th century, that question would erupt into fire. A sound of distant drums building into cannon fire, then silence. Progress and contradiction marched hand in hand, and America's destiny was about to be tested by the weight of its own ideals. Dividi Christian v. Obo. By 1860, the United States was no longer a young experiment. It was a nation divided morally, politically, and spiritually. The same country that declared all men are created equal had built its wealth on the backs of enslaved people. That contradiction had become too large to hide, too loud to ignore, and too dangerous to sustain. Abraham Lincoln once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And in that single sentence, he captured the storm that was coming. The Civil War wasn't just about territory or trade or politics. It was a reckoning. It was the nation's attempt to decide who it truly was. The South saw secession as survival, a defense of its identity, its autonomy, its rights. The North saw it as betrayal, a rebellion against the very idea of union. And when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the illusion of unity shattered. Brother turned against brother, friend against friend. Families split at the dinner table, never to speak again. The war was brutal beyond comprehension. More Americans died in those 4 years than in all previous wars combined. Fields once green with crops became fields of death. Towns burned. Railways shattered. The country bled from both ends. But beneath the horror, something profound was unfolding. For the first time, the question of human equality was being fought for not just in words, but in blood. Lincoln, often weary and burdened, carried the moral weight of the nation on his shoulders. His Emancipation Proclamation didn't instantly free all enslaved people, but it transformed the purpose of the war. It declared to the world that America was not fighting simply to survive, but to become what it had always claimed to be. Yet victory came with a price. When the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the land was free, but not healed. 4 million newly emancipated people stood on soil that had both enslaved and liberated them. The South lay in ruins, and in the North, exhaustion replaced celebration. Lincoln would not live to see the reconstruction he envisioned. One bullet, one man, one moment in Ford's theater, and the future of America shifted again. The war ended slavery, but not racism. It restored the Union, but not unity. It was both triumph and tragedy, light and shadow, rebirth and ruin. In that paradox lay the heart of America, a nation that could rise to its noblest ideals and sink to its darkest impulses, often in the same breath. A soft pause. The violin fades into the slow sound of a hammer striking an anvil. The rebuilding begins. Da deve di caresti en. The Civil War wasn't the end of a story. It was the turning of a page. The question now was, what kind of nation would emerge from the ashes? Would it be one haunted by its past, or one bold enough to redefine its future? The war tested whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure, and though it survived, it would never again be innocent. The guns fell silent, but America did not. The nation that emerged from the Civil War was scarred, divided, yet filled with an energy unlike any the world had seen before. Reconstruction promised justice and opportunity, but promises alone do not rebuild a nation. Cities needed to rise. Railroads needed to stretch farther. Industries needed to awaken the sleeping potential of human labor. Across the north, smokestacks pierced the skies. Coal-fired furnaces turned raw iron into steel, transforming cities from clusters of wooden houses into sprawling metropolises. Skyscrapers reached upward, almost as if to escape the shadows of the past. The nation's heartbeat was now mechanical, relentless, and deafening. Immigrants poured in by the millions, Irish, German, Italian, Polish, and countless others, seeking opportunity, but often finding sweat, peril, and crowded tenements. They built the railroads, the factories, and the bridges. Their hands, raw and calloused, shaped the landscape of the modern United States. Meanwhile, the South struggled to rise from the ashes. Freedmen tried to claim their place in a society that had enslaved them. Sharecropping and Jim Crow laws replaced the chains of bondage with new forms of oppression. The nation had ended slavery, but equality remained elusive, a distant promise hanging just beyond reach. In the midst of all this, America's economy transformed. The telegraph connected cities. Steam engines and railroads shrank distances. Innovations like the telephone and electricity reshaped daily life, while inventors and industrialists, from Thomas Edison to Andrew Carnegie, carved pathways to unimaginable wealth and influence. But wealth brought contradictions. Laborers endured long hours in dangerous conditions. Strikes erupted. Blood was spilled in factories and streets. The fight for rights, for fairness, for dignity, became the new revolution. And in these struggles, the American character revealed itself, once more relentless, restless, and unapologetically ambitious. Through all this, the nation continued to expand its moral and geographical borders. Territories became states, populations surged, and the United States began to assert itself on the global stage. The foundations of modern democracy were being tested and remade, tempered by fire, struggle, and ingenuity. By the dawn of the 20th century, America was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a powerhouse filled with contradictions, innovation and inequality, freedom and exploitation, promise and peril. Yet through it all, an idea persisted that the United States could constantly reinvent itself, rising from devastation into reinvention, tragedy into opportunity. The clang of hammers fades into the soft hum of a bustling city at night, the lights twinkling like stars. Dividi Christian. America was learning the rhythm of progress, a rhythm fueled by energy, by labor, by ambition, and by the belief that its experiment in freedom was far from over. In the roar of industry and the sweat of millions, America discovered the power of transformation and the cost it exacts on its people. The guns of global war fell silent in 1945, leaving behind a world both devastated and full of possibility. America emerged from World War II, not just victorious, but transformed. An industrial and military giant, a beacon for democracy, and the center of a rapidly changing global stage. Yet with power came responsibility, and with responsibility came questions the nation had never faced before. The Cold War began as a war ideologies, East versus West, democracy versus communism, freedom versus oppression. For decades, Americans lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation, knowing that a single miscalculation could erase centuries of progress in an instant. Yet the pressure also birthed genius. The space race lifted humanity off the Earth, transforming imagination into reality as rockets pierced the heavens. By 1969, humans walked on the moon, a literal manifestation of American ambition and ingenuity. Back on Earth, revolutions of a different kind were reshaping the social fabric. The civil rights movement tore through centuries of oppression, demanding justice where promises had failed. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and countless others gave voice to the voiceless, challenging the nation to live up to the ideals enshrined in its founding documents. Segregation, discrimination, and injustice clashed with the promise of liberty, forcing America to confront its own contradictions once more. Simultaneously, women challenged centuries of expectation. From the battlefields of workplaces to the halls of politics, women demanded equality, a redefinition of opportunity that reshaped families, communities, and the nation itself. The counterculture of the 1960s, with its music, protest, and experimentation, challenged the old assumptions of conformity, authority, and tradition. America was not just changing its laws, it was changing its mind. Technology accelerated this transformation. The birth of the computer, the internet, and cellular communications began connecting Americans in ways previously unimaginable. Information flowed at the speed of light. The world seemed smaller, ideas more potent, and opportunities simultaneously boundless and bewildering. But with this connection came new conflicts, cultural clashes, political polarization, and the rising question of identity. Who was America? And who could claim to belong? The nation's ideals, equality, freedom, democracy, were no longer abstract concepts. They were lived, debated, and fought over in classrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across the country. Through these decades, the United States became a laboratory of human experience, democracy tested, society reshaped, technology revolutionizing everything. And through it all, one constant remained: the enduring belief in the possibility of reinvention. The nation's story was far from finished, and its people learned, painfully and triumphantly, that progress is never linear. And soft crescendo of civil rights chants blending into digital beeps, symbolizing transition to the modern age. David C.H. Rice TIN. By the end of the 20th century, America had confronted its contradictions, stretched the limits of possibility, and expanded the boundaries of freedom and identity. It had proven that a nation could be resilient, reflective, and revolutionary in thought, in law, and in the hearts of its people. The United States of America had not just survived history, it had begun to reinvent it again and again in the minds and spirits of its citizens. As the 21st century dawned, America entered a new era, not of conquest, not of industry, but of connection. The digital revolution transformed every corner of life: communication, commerce, culture, even consciousness itself. Ideas moved faster than ever, spreading across fiber, optic veins, and invisible waves, linking Americans to each other and to the world. The promise of freedom, equality, and opportunity now intersected with unprecedented access to knowledge. Citizens could speak directly to leaders, organize movements online, and challenge authority from their living rooms. Yet with this power came new paradoxes. Social media amplified voices, but also division. Information flowed freely, but truth became contested. The very tools designed to connect humanity often amplified our fears and insecurities. In politics, the early 2000s tested America's principles under the strain of war, terror, and global crisis. Leaders faced decisions that reverberated across continents, while ordinary citizens navigated new dilemmas of privacy, security, and civic responsibility. Yet even amid turmoil, the American experiment endured, proving resilient against pressures that might have fractured lesser nations. Meanwhile, innovation continued to surge. Tech giants reshaped economies. Artificial intelligence began to influence decision-making, and space exploration rekindled dreams once realized with Apollo's triumphs. The United States remained a pioneer, balancing ambition with ethics, creativity with consequence, and power with principle. Culturally, the nation wrestled with identity more than ever. Debates over race, gender, and inclusion intensified. Movements emerged, demanding accountability, recognition, and justice. The nation's ideals, once written on parchment, debated in salons, or spoken from pulpits were now lived, tested, and redefined daily. America was proving again that freedom is not a static inheritance, but an active pursuit. And then came the crises of climate change, pandemics, and global instability, challenges no single generation could have imagined. Yet, for all the uncertainty, there remained a through line: the enduring human capacity to adapt, to innovate, to hope. For over 4 centuries, America has been an experiment, sometimes messy, often painful, always bold. 423 years from the first settlers to the digital frontier of today. One lesson stands out: the American story is unfinished. It is written not by the powerful alone, but by every citizen, every thinker, every activist, every dreamer. Its narrative depends on engagement, on courage, and on the willingness to confront both past mistakes and future possibilities. So music swells triumphantly, blending orchestral strings with modern digital tones. Degavied CH, Bryce Tian. The United States of America is more than a nation. It is a mirror of humanity's potential. Brilliant, flawed, resilient, and daring. The question for every one of us is simple: will we honor the experiment? Will we ensure that liberty, equality, and justice are not mere words, but lived realities for generations to come? The real history of America isn't written in books, statutes, or speeches. It is written in us, in our choices, in our courage, and in the dreams we dare to pursue. The story continues, and the future is ours to shape.